go ahead and skip ahead. We're going to go to Washington, D.C. now to say hello to Leonardo Crippa, and he is a senior attorney at the Indian Law Resource Center. And Leonardo is Goya from Argentina. Leonardo, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for inviting me to participate in this program.
Well, it is definitely our pleasure, and we want to get insight into some of these issues. And you've been working on a case to fight a proposed wind farm in Oaxaca, Mexico. Set the place for us. Where is this area in Oaxaca, and who are the indigenous groups who are living there?
Sure. Oaxaca is a state in Mexico, and the wind farm was proposed to be built in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, which is an area in Oaxaca that is located between the ocean and several lagoons. Because of the wind energy in that area, a private sector company decided to propose a project to the Inter-American Development Bank and other private sector investors. But the design of the project was not something that was informed or consulted with 7 indigenous communities that were potentially affected by this project, who happen to be my clients in this case.
And, I definitely know that our listeners can relate to consultation and the use of lands or places that they hold, sacred. And we even heard a lot of indigenous leaders this past year, telling the federal government directly about the need for consultation. And so, Leonardo, you are painting that picture for us very well. And when we do talk about not consulting indigenous communities, what does it really, mean? I mean, we can say they didn't consult, but what happens when that indigenous voice is left out of the conversation, especially when it comes to making decisions about land that people have been connected to for generations?
Problems, basically. For a project to be developed on lands belonging to indigenous communities, it is a setback simply because when their participation in decision-making was not taken into account, the project most of the time find opposition during the implementation stage. And so many projects, with or without funding from public sector banks like the Inter-American Development Bank, may go forward with the approval of a loan from these banks and going forward with the design of the project. But when they go through the implementation phase of the project and they haven't been properly consulting with the communities that are entitled to the ownership of the land located in the project area, they run into problems. And in most cases, they have to leave the area and they have to pay back the loan that they haven't used or used in a very bad way.
And Leonardo, when we say the type of consultation, is it spelled out what is supposed to happen when it comes to consulting indigenous people, or can one meeting or one letter count as consultation?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Both from the UN and the Organization of American States declarations on the rights of indigenous peoples, a legal standard on how consultations with indigenous peoples have to be carried out was established. And for this purpose, many indigenous representatives and representatives of member states discussed this new standard, which is currently one actual article in each of these declarations. And it basically spells out how a free, prior, and informed consultation has to be made when an action, proposed action, or in this case a project, a wind power project, would affect communities, especially their most fundamental rights, the right to life, their land rights, and other human rights that are protected by human rights treaties. And these legal standards have been reflected in bank policies. For example, the Inter-American Development Bank has adopted in 2006 a policy on indigenous peoples, which basically sets the standards for project proponents, in this case, countries or companies like the wind farm company, to comply with all of the regulations established in that policy. One of them is about consultation with indigenous peoples during the design of any project that would affect their lands. That is, indigenous communities living in a project area have to be fully informed about the project in a very cultural and appropriate manner, which means that key documents about the project have to be made available in the native language, and a complete disclosure of the documents have to be made. That is, in not only those that are necessary to inform the community about how a project would affect the community, but also all of the documents that are related to the project and that are of mandatory release according to the policy.
And so, Leonardo, with that said, and especially being a legal, as some would say, an attorney who has your eye on this, what's your take in any of the process? Did anything violate Mexican law?
That's another good question. And yes, the reason is this. In Mexico, there is a legislation that requires certain percentage in the assembly of the communities to make decisions on how to change the use of their land. They are collectively held lands. And for the purpose of this wind farm project, only one of these 7 communities was consulted, not all of them, but that one community that was consulted made a decision without meeting the right percentage to make a decision about changing the use of the land to, in this case, to be used for the purpose of building a wind farm, transmission lines in the land belonging to all of the membership.
And so when we take a look at why, definitely consultation and just hearing how you've explained this, I can already see where, some of these red flags are going up. Leonardo, is there another reason other than consultation why indigenous groups in the area are opposing this wind farm?
Yes. The consultation, I would say, is a procedural right that any community that is going to be affected is entitled to. But that procedural right means also very substantive rights. For example, the right to life, the right to religion, the right to lands and resources pertaining to those lands. So in this particular case, there are self-government rights, there are collective ownership of the land, and their right to life as a native community were at risk. And the reason is because many of the elements of this wind farm project were going to affect those substantive rights. For example, a wind farm was going to be built in a sandbar that belongs to one community but has sacred sites for all of these 7 communities. So there are religion freedom, there are rights to practice traditional ceremonies were going to be seriously harmed. The transmission lines and all of the infrastructure that would allow the company to build the wind farm in that sandbar were also going to affect the ownership rights of these communities, these 7 communities, because roads were going to be built to reach the sandbar, and transmission lines were also going to be built to cross all of the lands belonging to these 7 communities. So it's important to keep in mind that consultation is a very important right. However, this right doesn't stand alone. There are other more substantive rights that are critical to be aware of and to build a strategy to seek legal protection of those rights, such as the right to life, the right to religion, the right to lands and natural resources, and so forth.
Yeah, and I think that's maybe where some people's ears perked up, because we can definitely relate struggles in the United States as well as Canada, of Indigenous communities and this threat. One of the biggest stories out of 2016 also has roots in sacred sites being disturbed. Folks, if there's anything you'd like to share, give us a ring, 1-800-996-2848. What about what Leonardo just explained about the right to practice religion? Give us a call. 1-800-996-2848 is the number. And Leonardo, similar, stance against wind farms came about in one of the most eastern parts of the country, where a tribal nation was against a wind farm, in a place where they welcome in the day, the first people of the light. And so just hearing that, sometimes you got to wonder about where some of these developments are taking place. Leonardo, is there anything you can share about why this wind farm is in an area where Indigenous people are? Is this another case of racism?
In this particular case, the potential for wind energy is huge. This is not the first wind farm that was going to be built in that area. There are already about 4 to 7 wind farms, and the indigenous communities in that area have learned critical lessons from those wind farms that are already operating there. That means they do know the harm that these wind energy projects can bring to their communities, to their families. And I wouldn't say this is a case that speaks about racism, but this is a case where the project proponent, the wind energy industry, is not learning lessons from its own past failures in projects, because the opposition that we can find today in these communities in Oaxaca, Mexico, is not new for them. However, they continue to make the same mistakes as they've done in the past. And if that's something that we have to learn, that is something that these project developers have to be very aware of. It is not a situation where you would like to invest resources if the conditions to meet the goals of the project are not feasible because of past failures.
And Leonardo, a lot of times when you have situations like this and, more attention or spotlight is being brought to the people that are going to be affected by some of these developments, is there anybody who is a backer and changed their mind and have pulled out because of some of this attention or this awareness that's being raised by Indigenous people about how it's affecting their lifeways, culture, and religion?
Not that I'm aware of in that area. However, there is an indigenous community. It is called the Ixtepec community in the same area, Oaxaca, in Mexico. That community decided to design a community-based wind farm project. And for that purpose, it has entered into procedural processes before the energy agency in Mexico to compete with, the usual wind farm companies. And so they are in that process. They are not doing that alone. It's a self-determined decision by this community, given the experience that neighbor communities have gone through in terms of dealing with wind farms. And so this is something to watch very carefully. I think a community-based development project is way better than projects that are imposed by third parties to communities. And of course, it's a way better option for those communities who have never been even consulted about a wind farm that was going to be built on their own lands.
And so, Leonardo, just hearing some of this and just knowing how sometimes it goes where, standing up for your rights as an indigenous person, sometimes you get pitted as the bad guy, the person who doesn't want development. Is there any dialogue surrounding that or targets towards these communities as being even anti going green?
I don't think so. I think that economic development is important for every people, including indigenous peoples. And I think indigenous peoples around the world, especially in the developing world, are supportive of development. But the priorities for those development projects have to be discussed in advance with indigenous communities. Otherwise, those projects will find opposition, like in this case in Oaxaca, Mexico. The other reason to say this is that many indigenous communities in the world are starting to develop projects to seek economic development in their communities. And they are doing so to get support from public sector development banks as a way to show them that there is another way to seek economic development, and that having indigenous peoples as partners in development is the best way to go forward with this.
And Leonardo, as we get ready to go to our break here, is there anything more to report when it comes to wind farms and maybe someplace else that folks can keep their eye on that have intersected with indigenous nations?
No, that I would suggest, folks. I just think that this community-based wind farm project in Oaxaca is something to follow up, something to monitor. It can lead to good results. It can open up the way this business is being made in Mexico, in a country where there is an opening for discussions about wind energy, and this is the right time to bring up these issues from an indigenous point of view. And so I would suggest to follow up on these issues in Oaxaca, Mexico, where things are happening right now.
Well, I think you said it very well. It's important to hear an indigenous voice, their take and what they're facing when it comes to this. And, there's a lot of stories that where that indigenous voice is missing. And today we're helping to try and connect some of that, and so that you hear how it is affecting Native people. Leonardo, Crippa, thank you for being with us today. And folks, the Indian Law Resource Center can be reached online, and they definitely do a lot of work in Native communities and, as you hear, internationally as well.